making something sound jazzy is a question I get all the time, usually actually from classical players wanting to make something sound jazzy. Now I've got a few tips on easy things that you can actually do to make something sound jazzy, and today I'm going to talk about grace notes. Now grace notes I think are a way of emulating a pitch bend. They're not instead of a pitch bend. A pitch bend is a very important and very relevant technique, but a grace note again is a great way, an easy way of making something sound jazzy. And I'm going to take you through how we implement grace notes into a phrase and then an example of how we can put them on a phrase. Before we get onto the grace notes though, I'm going to introduce you to two scales. First one is an A minor pentatonic. Now I'm playing this on a B flat instrument, but you can play this on any instrument. The music's on the screen now. Just either play along with me if it's B flat or play it on your own. So that is an A minor pentatonic scale. Before we move on to our grace notes, I'm going to bring in another scale, which is a blues scale. The only thing we need to do to change our minor pentatonic into a blues scale is add a flattened fifth, which you can see has appeared there in this scale as an E flat. Remember, we add that flattened fifth. We don't substitute that for the natural fifth. Moving on to the grace notes. How can we implement them? What do we do to get them into a phrase? Now, the first example I'm going to give you is an ascending grace note. So that's a grace note moving up chromatically from a G sharp to an A. So this is onto the tonic of that scale, and it sounds quite effective. Notice how all of these grace notes that I'll bring in today are going to be chromatic. Okay, so this is a G sharp to an A, chromatic ascending grace note. Another example of an ascending grace note, and now this is where the blues scale comes in useful, because that flattened fifth really does make something sound quite jazzy. We're going to do an ascending grace note from the E flat to the E natural. Again, like I said, this brings in that flattened fifth, which makes something sound a little bit more jazzy. So this is an E flat to an E natural grace note, again ascending, going up. So those two examples are ascending grace notes going up chromatically. Now, something that I think is quite underused is a descending grace note. Again, chromatic, but a descending grace note I think is just as effective as an ascending grace note, and they should be used and they should be practiced. So the first example I'm going to give you here is a descending grace note from the G sharp to the G natural. So this is descending chromatically onto the 7th degree of the scale. As you can hear, it's quite a different sound than the ascending grace note, but as I said, it's a very important one and should be practiced and implemented into a phrase to make something sound jazzy. The second descending grace note that I'm going to give you is, again, bringing in this flattened fifth, which makes something sound jazzy. It's a descending grace note from the E flat to the D natural. Okay, so again, we're getting that flattened fifth sound, but it's used as a grace note to move down onto the D. Okay, so the grace note is a descending from E flat to D. Now, how do we implement this into a phrase? I've just put on the screen there two phrases. Well, it's one full phrase, but I'm going to split it into two phrases. We're going to talk about how I'm using these grace notes in these two little sections. So the first one goes like this. So we can see we start off with an ascending grace note onto the tonic. We've then got an ascending grace note which brings in that flattened fifth, and then a descending grace note that brings in that flattened fifth from the E flat to the D towards the end. This is the second half of the phrase that you can see on the screen. So you can see that I have purposefully added these grace notes into that phrase. This isn't something that you can just practice on its own and think that it's going to happen. You need to actually practice these grace notes on their own and then practice them in a phrase. But purposefully put them on. If you're reading from music, then purposefully add these grace notes to the music so you can see how they're going to work. If they don't work, rub them out. If they do work, keep them in and practice them again. So that is a grace note. How grace notes can be used to make something sound jazzy. Implement them to very simple scales, use them chromatically, use them a lot, and then you'll decide you'll end up moving that into your own language. You'll add the grace notes where you want them to be, and you'll move them away from where you don't want them to be. Very important way of making something sound jazzy.